So once again, it's great to be able to welcome you all here this evening, and it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Cillian McGrattan, our speaker for this evening. Dr. McGrattan is a graduate of the Ulster University and is also previously a Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow at University College Dublin. And following this, he returned ultimately to the Ulster University, where he now lectures in politics at that institution. Amongst other books, he is the author of Northern Ireland, 1968 to 2008, The Politics of Entrenchment, as well as the Northern Ireland Conflict, which he co-authored with Dr. Aaron Edwards, as well as Peacebuilding and the Politics of Trauma, Lessons from Northern Ireland. He is currently completing a book on anti-sectarianism in Northern Ireland, to be published by Palgrave, and he's also working on one concerning border Protestant memory during the Northern Ireland conflict. This time his co-author is Ken Funston, and it is hoped that this work will be forthcoming in 2024. And indeed it is this work, or his research on this work, which informs his address to us this evening, which is entitled Keeping Your Head Down, Border Protestant Experiences During the Troubles. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cillian McGrattan.
Okay, hopefully you can all hear me. I just wanted to start with saying thank you for inviting me down here. And thank you all for coming out on such a tough, hard winter's evening. Especially given the nature of tonight's talk, which is not going to be the most light-hearted, shall we say, of talks. It's based on a book that myself and Ken Funston, who did a PhD at the University of Ulster, he did it part-time, so he was doing it over a long period of time. I think it was about 2017, 2018 he finished. And it's in press now, so hopefully it'll be coming out. But whether it comes out this year or next year, I'm not sure. But I need to credit Ken on me plagiarising a lot of his work here tonight as well. Okay. I should also say I'll try and keep to this place. Normally, as part of whenever I'm lecturing, I think it's part of like a fight and flight type of response, and I tend to dander about the room, so I do. So I'll try to keep to my place here. Also, I think I'm quite quietly spoken, so if there's anything you aren't picking up, just give me a shout and I'll repeat it. So or if there's anything you want to take up as well at the end, I mean, happy to chat about anything in around this talk or some of the broader implications. So with that in mind, let's make a wee proper start then. Let's get my notes up. I wasn't really too sure how to start this. I tend to think kind of dialectically. I tend to define things in opposition to things, and try to identify things by what they're not. And I think that provides a kind of an insight into what I want to try to get across tonight. Whenever we think about civil conflict, civil war, social unrest, societal breakdown, and violence and bloodshed, there's a couple of main ways that people tend to think about it. One is the classic Hobbesian idea, Thomas Hobbes writing in the time of Cromwell and then Charles I. And that's the idea of whenever authority breaks down, you're going to have rival groups and they will come to clash in the absence of that strong centre. So Hobbes obviously is kind of kind of leaned towards the monarchy, but was kind of playing the odds a bit. And the Cromwell would have fitted into his idea of the strong man, the Leviathan, the strong state, just as well as a monarchy. To place order, to make sure that contracts are upheld, that peace is enforced. The other main way of thinking about social unrest is the Thucydidean model, i.e. the Athens versus Sparta. You have two contradictory, diametrically, ideologically, and every type of way opposed societies. Whenever you get that kind of condition arising, they will inevitably come into conflict. And I want to suggest tonight that I don't want to contradict or argue against those, but what I want to suggest is that the work that Ken and I were doing suggests another way into thinking about social fracturing. Because it's not inevitable that societies where you have two or more conflicting groups, ideologically, religiously, ethnically, whatever, opposed, it's not inevitable that they will come into conflict, that there will be bloodshed. Yes, there'll be contention, yes, there'll be differences, but it's not inevitable that those contending groups, those contending communities will spiral into bloodshed. And the explanation that we were finding that was coming out was that it was to do with the targeting of individuals. The targeting of individuals, of individual families, of businesses, that this created a kind of a feedback that led to the spiraling of polarization, of breakdown of relations, and of bloodshed, of suspicions and fears, of sectarianism, and so on and so forth. The reason for that is that the targeting of individuals or families or businesses or farms dehumanizes victims as legitimate targets. It extends that implication to entire groups, entire communities, or entire tradition. And this is what we were finding was coming out, particularly whenever we went to speak to people and asking them about their memories and their perceptions of the violence, that it was a very much an individualized experience. And so for that reason, tonight's talk is going to be focused on those memories, on those experiences, on those stories. I'm not going to avoid, but those kind of main events like, Bloody Sunday, the hunger strikes, Bobby Sands, Enniskillen bombing, they'll be there in the background, but what I want to really focus on is those stories and those memories that were coming out from that experience. Off to a good start with the technology. So, I've broken the talk into about 4 different sections. I'm going to start to talk, first of all, about just the general background. Then I want to look at the border and the experiences of the border. And I want to conclude with a couple of conclusions, or a conclusion and a postscript, looking at the idea of memory and research in memory, and also this idea of what happens when remembrance doesn't take place, of the non-spaces of memory, and how do you go about research, and how do we go about finding out those kind of gaps that are not immediately apparent in the main go-to sources, the newspapers, the government archives, and so on and so forth. I don't know whether this is a bit de trop, but I'm just going to put in almost an apology to start with in terms of terminology. The debate in Northern Ireland, if anybody hasn't been kind of keeping up with it, has become increasingly saturated with a politicization of language, and the language that's used on both sides of the divide. The language that's used is can often be triggering, or often be seen as hiding some kind of an agenda. So I don't really buy into that, because I kind of just use the words as they kind of come to me, and I'm kind of speaking, ad hoc. And I also say to the students, to my students as well, I think, whenever you're kind of studying Northern Ireland, or you're kind of growing up and you see in Northern Ireland on the news or whatever, you kind of realise that there are different words that people use. The North, Northern Ireland, the 6 counties, whatever, and we kind of understand that's there. So I'm just kind of taking that almost as a given. But other terms can be loaded, and I will just be using them interchangeably. So terms like, what are we even talking about here? Are we talking about a conflict? Are we talking about a war? Well, some victims would say it wasn't a war, because there was no kind of legitimate forces, and that's seen as offensive. Are we talking about terrorism? Well, was it terrorism? Was it legitimate? Infamously, or famously, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is used. Well, Belfast Agreement by Unionists, Good Friday Agreement by Nationalists. And ironically, it didn't have a name on the thing that was sent out. It was just called the Agreement. So a lot of this is also a construct of politics, not just a kind of a rereading or a reading into of politics, but also a construct. I'm not kind of making any real differences between Catholics, Protestants, nationalists, unionists, that kind of thing. I'm just kind of taking that as given that mostly Protestants are unionists, mostly Catholics are nationalists. Yeah. I don't think I'll be talking about the Brits very much, but the Brits is kind of used colloquially for the British Army. So just a bit of background then, just in terms of setting the scene. Just over 3,600 deaths in the period from roughly 1968 to 1999. The main and probably the key text, I would argue, is the Lost Lives book, which records all of the Troubles' deaths. So I'm taking this from the 1999 edition. There was a couple more updates to it, but it's out of print now. But I'm taking most of these figures from the 1999 edition. So these are taken as far as 1999. But basically, in around 60% of Troubles-related deaths were attributable to Republicans. 2,139 people killed by Republicans, and just under 400 Republicans killed. Loyalist paramilitaries were responsible for just under 30% of the deaths, about 1,000 people killed. Loyalists suffered 144 deaths. The British state security forces, the police, the RUC, and the army were responsible for in around 10% of the killings. And often these were the result of legitimate exercise of duty. The army was responsible for 300 deaths and the RUC 52. The army suffered 709 and the police just over 300. In proportional terms, these would translate to around 100,000 deaths in the UK across these 3 decades, or about 500,000 in the US. So although the numbers might be objectively small in comparison to other war zones, proportionately, they're quite high, especially whenever we're going to look at some of the other demographic type stats in a couple of slides' time. in around 40,000 other individuals were injured as a result of the violence. Perhaps 1 out of every 3 families in Northern Ireland was affected in some way. Violence wasn't spread uniformly across the period. The high points were in 1972 and the early 70s, and then it reaches what was notoriously described as an acceptable level of violence from the late 1970s onwards, where Republicans begin to settle into what they saw as the long war of process of attrition. And killings weren't uniformly spread throughout. North Belfast, West Belfast disproportionately affected, and border regions, South Armagh, Fermanagh, disproportionately affected, Mid-Ulster. I'm originally from Portaferry, and Portaferry's down at the bottom of the Ards Peninsula, not affected at all, really. North Antrim, the same. So there's moving on to kind of into the main part of the talk now. In around, it was 1989, political scientist working at Queen's, John White, his book was published posthumously, but he reckoned at that point there was about 7,000 pieces of research written in Northern Ireland. He suggested that Northern Ireland was one of the most researched ethnic conflict areas, and I mean that figure has grown exponentially. There has, over this past few years, especially since Brexit, although a couple of these books predate Brexit, a growing interest in the border. So there's a massive volume of literature on the ethnic violence that engulfed Northern Ireland between the late 1960s and then the 1990s. And say more recently, we've had more and more books on the border. Henry Patterson's book looked particularly at government sources from the UK, although he spent a good bit of time in the Irish archives as well. Colin Tobin's book, I have a date of it here. I can't find it off the top of my head, but Colin Tobin's book was published in 1987, reprinted in 2010. One of the best books, I think, and actually, we may argue about this, but one of in my opinion, one of Colin Tobin's best books. A very interesting book just on the whole kind of Brexit scenario and the outworkings of where things would go is Brendan O'Leary's book, which I think came out, I was going to say last year, but I think it was 2022 it came out. Rosemary Harris's book is an interesting one. Rosemary Harris had spent a bit of time in 1952, 1953 as a PhD student doing ethnography. Her book, she went and did other things, and her book wasn't published until 1972, her PhD research. And she went on to look at other cases and other areas. But despite that kind of 20-year gap from 52 to 72, her book was one of the kind of founding studies of what identity looks like in Northern Ireland, what identity looks like in rural Northern Ireland, what identity looks like in the border areas. And she focused particularly on the everyday experiences of individuals and families and communities living in a border town, which she anonymized. Her work spoke to a kind of a paradox which persisted this paradox of neighbourliness, where people could be living on the same street, on the same road, living as neighbours, but as she suggests that, quote, they belong to different sides and remain in some senses strangers, end quote. This paradox of neighbourliness was about getting on together, people trying, quote, in normal circumstances to avoid behaviour likely to cause hostility. In other words, to keep latent hostility latent. And because of this, she argued that people adopted various kinds of ways of behaving with the religious other. She saw strife as being located at that interpersonal level. Now, Harris provided a kind of a takeoff, a point of departure for Ken and mine's research. Although we kind of criticise her a bit in terms of very kind of structuralist and very kind of sociological, that kind of an idea of how people learn to live with difference, and then how people learn to live with violence, with fear, with suspicion, became more and more apparent as you start to talk to victims and start to look at newspaper reports and start to look at how people remembered that time. And in some ways this persists. This isn't, it's not anything groundbreaking, because it has to persist because of the nature of the border that crisscrosses farms, that crisscrosses roads, that is, kind of drawn along the boundaries of fields and the boundaries of streams and rivers. It's kind of obviously, as I've alluded to, it has come back into public consciousness north and south of the border since June 2016 with the Brexit vote. And more recently, if anybody's been shopping in Tesco or anything in Northern Ireland, you'll notice lots of signs at checkouts, or if you pick up a steak or a chicken breast or something, you'll see that this, you're not allowed. I don't know what the consequences are for transporting this from Northern Ireland into the EU, but you can see in these that it's not. You mightn't be able to see it at the back, but it's not for EU, and you see these on the at the checkouts in Tesco and places too. So even though the border doesn't affect the majority of people, because the majority of people in Northern Ireland are kind of based in around the Belfast, Lurgan, suppose up in Derry right enough, but based in around here, it's still this ever-present thing, and it's become much more of a everyday thing in people's lives, particularly over the past few years. So this brings me to the second part of the talk then, and probably the main thing that I was wanting to chat about tonight. Because some of those resonances that are kind of coming out now, we find being read back into what was going on in the past. And we describe this as the individualization of ethnicity. This idea of the targeting of people based on their ethno-religious background. So, what does this look like? Well, it's that basic green-orange, Catholic Protestant, Unionist, nationalist split. And this had deleterious consequences for the Protestant community, particularly in the Fermanagh region, in the county of Fermanagh. So one example of this, and just in stark terms, 1971, the population of the county was just over 50,000 people. 47.6 were deemed to be Catholics. 1987, the Catholic percentage was said to be 54.5, so that's going from 47.6 to 54.5. By 2001, it was 58.7%. So the Catholic proportion of Fermanagh moved from 48% 1971 to just under 60% in 2001. Fermanagh, this is taking place in the context of Fermanagh being something like the 29th least populated county in all of Ireland. It takes place in the context as well of Fermanagh doesn't have peace walls, doesn't have peace lines, those euphemisms of barbed wire that keeps the ethno-nationalist blocks apart particularly in Belfast. People are divided just by houses, people are divided by farms, and families are divided along those lines. And of course, Fermanagh has a history of ethno-religious violence. The 1956 to 62 IRA campaign, which was deliberately focused on the border in order to avoid sectarian reprisals in places like Belfast and Derry, was, as I said, particularly focused on areas like Fermanagh. But at that point, as Henry Patterson points out in his book, the unionist minority community's feeling in the border areas was moderated by an apparent lack of support by nationalists for the Republican campaign. And in some ways, the IRA recognised that problem by declaring an end to its border campaign in February 1962. This is taken from the declaration of the winding up of that campaign. At this point too, the IRA made the decision not to directly attack members of what was known as the B Specials, the reserve force, because they thought that that would be seen as being sectarian. This would change, as we'll talk about in a couple of slides' time, during the Troubles. So there's 116 deaths recorded in Fermanagh during the conflict. And you can see the vast majority are attributable to the Provisional IRA. Again, just take a kind of a break or parentheses just to fill in just some of the historical background to this. Probably a lot of you will know this, but just to kind of cover these early years. So what was happening? Well, Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, very much a kind of a niche, kind of middle class group based in around Tyrone for the first few years. Taking its inspiration of I remember interviewing activists in around 2007, 2008. It must have been for the 40th anniversary, and every person, to a person, basically was saying, we were following Martin Luther King, we were following, what was happening in '63 in the US. And very much saw themselves as part of that tradition. But it really only starts to become a mass movement in around the formation of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, 1967, and then really only with the October the 5th march in Duke Street, which I I don't know if it was called that at the time, but basically, you know, the terminology now, we call it kettling, where the police come in at both sides of the street, and it was captured by an RTE. Simon Prince points out in his book that, you know, there's marches all the time in Derry. The police battered the protesters all the time, but it was only whenever this was captured on video camera by RTE that this really took off in 1968, and obviously resonant of similar scenes in the US and from earlier in the 60s. The army, so violence begins to spiral out of control, violence in the streets, rioting, the army's brought in, police, the RUC are exhausted by the summer of 69, army's brought in August 1969. And really, you know, a turning point or a critical juncture, a missed opportunity, because what would have happened then if Britain had have taken over, or if London had have taken over. The winter of 1969, the IRA see that as their opportunity to continue their war to, as they saw it, the Brits. Spiraling of violence in 1970. August 1971, Brian Faulkner, the Union's Prime Minister, basically saying to Edward Heath, the Conservative, Faulkner, the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, saying to Edward Heath, the British Prime Minister, we don't really care about the politics of this, it's security, we need to get the security situation back under control. In order to do that, we need to introduce internment. At that point, Heath is saying, this is and you see this in the papers, you know, Heath basically said, this is the last throw of the dice, if this doesn't work, you know, we're going to take drastic action here. And by the autumn of that year, internment hadn't worked, and Heath had basically, you know, said to Faulkner and the Unionists, if you can't get the Catholic community back on board, we're taking over. Bloody Sunday, which was an anti-internment march, happens in January 1972, and Britain does take direct control in March, a month later. So that's kind of the broad kind of focus. Well, what was actually happening? Well, one of the interviewees was saying that, you know, that this spiraling of violence was having a direct impact on people's lives in the Fermanagh region. There was a lot of antagonism. My father my father, who was a part-time member of the UDR, had received a lot of abuse from the other community, i.e. the nationalist community. He felt that because he was doing his duty during internment, that it wasn't just his uniform being targeted. He maybe would have considered leaving, but I think he had actually gone too far down the road to actually have that as an option. And this is something I want to return to, this idea of leaving, of being forced to leave, of feeling, you know, that wasn't a possibility for whatever reasons. Come back to that towards the end, just to kind of put a pin in that now. Internment certainly did do a lot of damage to community relationships. Whether it's right or wrong, I think it didn't do my father any good. I think he probably felt that he had no option but to leave his home and settle elsewhere, and that's what happened. So the troubles begin in Fermanagh with the killing of Frank Vetch in 1970, September the 3rd, 1971. He was a part-time member of the RUC Reserve. He was outside a police station and was shot when IRA gunmen opened fire from a car, killing him almost instantly. 19 people were to die in Fermanagh in 1972. And these deaths had a profound effect on the largely rural population, raising levels of fear and suspicion. The border areas were unprotected, and isolated Protestants became very wary of their neighbours and the unknown latent threat from across the border. So an example of this kind of isolation then relates to an attack on the Barton farm in February 1972 Barton Farm. So the border, you can just see at the top end of the picture, the border's kind of running down here, kind of following this stream. And this is the Barton Farm here. The road just leads right across, so Northern Ireland and the Republic. So February 1972, Johnny Barton, another part-time reservist, was attacked on his farm by Republican gunmen. He survived the ordeal despite being wounded a number of times. On the 20th of July, the Republicans returned again in another attempt to kill him. He was out in his farmyard this time at 7 a.m. They opened fire on him, and despite the gunmen firing a number of times, he was hit just once in the hand. 2 other rounds passed so close to him that it caused burns to his right hip. The village of Tullyhoman and Pettigo is basically one village separated by the border. This was the scene of a number of attacks during the 1970s. And just a couple that were kind of related that I just wanted to draw attention to, because it concerned a couple of families, a couple of businesses. So in June then, 1972, the IRA attacked the post office. During the robbery, they shot and injured the postmaster, who was called Derek Howe. They also shot and injured a bus driver outside before they made their way, they made their getaway across the border bridge. Derek Howe's wife was in the post office when the robbery and the shootings took place. She described how they put her husband down on the ground whilst they robbed the till. Quote, "When he, i.e. one of the Republicans, one of the IRA volunteers, was going out through the door, he just fired at him, Derek, point blank, lying on the floor. I was there and I saw it. I thought, oh my God, he's dead. Derek was shot through the left femur and badly injured, spending approximately a year in hospital, both in Enniskillen and Belfast." Whilst he was in hospital, the IRA returned to attack Mervyn Johnson's garage in Tullyhoman on Friday the 21st of July. Johnson noticed there was a suspicious car parked outside his garage when he got up in the morning to open up, and he tried to start to clear the village himself. Because he was wary of the vehicle, he alerted the Howe family. They come out to assist him, and together they heard a ticking, which was a bomb in the car boot. So they all evacuated the premises, and Mrs. Howe, who had 3 small children at the time, said if Derek's father hadn't been there and heard the clock ticking, or if Mervyn Johnson, who owned the garage, hadn't been down in the garage at 6 o'clock in the morning, we'd all have been killed. The subsequent explosion destroyed not only Johnson's garage, but it also badly damaged Howe's post office, shop, and their family home. As I mentioned, the father, Derek Howe, was still in hospital recovering, leaving his wife with responsibility as head of the family to manage the shop, manage the post office. They were essentially homeless. The house needed a new roof, new windows, etc., structural damage. She had to move in with her in-laws. Quote, "I had 3 small children. I just couldn't cope with everything. The shop went under at that stage." The Provisional IRA attacked Tullyhoman again on Monday the 6th of November 1972. It was the 6th bomb attack on the village that year. Let's skip over some of the other details. There's farm attacks too. So businesses attacked, farms attacked. One kind of notorious example of this was in July 72 when the IRA descended on a small rural farm about 400 yards from the Monaghan border. The inhabitants were a Protestant family named McGrattan. None of the family was in the security forces. One of the family described the incident. My first memory was a post van arrived one Saturday morning, and the IRA arrived at the same time, held us up and burned the post van in our yard. They gave us our letters out of the post van, but they burned it, and that was the first. The bread van came one Saturday morning, the same thing happened. The IRA held us up before it happened. When it arrived, they took us out round by our Catholic neighbours and burned it. The milk tanker was also burned at our house. In July 72, the Provisional IRA gang forced its way into the McGrattan house, put the family of 6, some of whom were in bed, into one room, then proceeded to ransack the house, poured petrol into each room. They stole Mrs. McGrattan's handbag. They also took any money they could find and the watches of the children. They marched the family outside under gunpoint and lined them up against the wall. Mr. McGrattan thought they were all going to be shot. He said they threw petrol bombs into all the rest of the rooms, then they ran us out down a lane in our nightwear, and the whole house was on fire. They also burned the hay shed, all the cars. There were some animals burned, and after that, then the fire brigade and everything arrived, and everything was ruined at that stage. We got a mobile home there and stayed there till we got things sorted out. Then we got a house in Lisnaskea. That's where we've been ever since. The McGrattan attack had historical overtones. Their home had previously been owned by a family called Nixon. Samuel Nixon had been a police reservist and had been attacked on the farm on the 21st of March 1921, when Republicans had killed him. His widow later moved out of the area. Mr. McGrattan commented, "When we did the house up, we found the bullet in the door. The bullet was in the door cage where the man, that is Nixon, was shot in the house." Individuals were also targeted and attacked. It was the anniversary of the killing of Tommy and Emily Bullock a couple of years ago in September 2022. The Belfast newsletter ran a story at the time kind of remembering this and pointing out that nobody had ever been prosecuted for the killings. It had seemed that Emily knew the gunmen who had knocked at the door. She had answered it, and police suggested that they thought she might have known the people who had been knocking. They immediately blasted her with gunfire, then stepped over her body, spraying bullets everywhere, and killing Tommy, who was an off-duty police officer. Their niece said, they were not blessed with any of their own children, so the immediate bloodline died with them. They were well liked and respected within the area and indeed across the community. But there were clearly some of those who saw them as legitimate targets in their campaign of sectarian and ethnic genocide. This idea of ethnic cleansing, sectarianism, genocide has come up in some of the debates in terms of dealing with the past. There's been various academic engagements with the idea. I suppose we can talk about that, but the main point that I want to get across here, and we'll come back to this in a couple of slides' time again, is this was a real feeling, and it was one of the kind of the key memories and key lessons that were taken from events such as these by the Protestant community. Because there was growing sectarianisation. Church of Ireland research into the killings pointed out that people were taking guns to church with them, just constant pressure. Attacks on the police, attacks on the army resulted in collateral killings and such as Sylvia Crow, who was waiting for a bus when an army patrol was attacked in 1979. This polarization grew out of the fears of people informing on neighbours and the fears of this ongoing violence. And this was certainly something that the Protestant community in the border region kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of really took from this period. So, for instance, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1980. The speaker pointed out that it was strongly contended that there was a plot to exterminate Protestant farmers in border areas so their farms would pass out of Protestant possession. And this is very much, it was a perception thing, but it was also became increasingly exacerbated, shall we say, by the hunger strikes in the election of Bobby Sands in 1981. Now, of course, you know, the mural of Bobby Sands on the Sinn Féin offices in the Falls Road is this kind of avuncular, you know, smiling, you know, long-haired guy. His funeral, attended by something like 100,000 people. The perception within the Protestant community, however, was very different. One of our interviewees pointed out when the terrorist Sands stood for election in Fermanagh, South Tyrone, I was horrified. Before the result, I was horrified at the insult to nationalists in the area that they would be expected to vote for someone so evil. I imagined how insulted I would be at the idea that I would be expected to vote for a loyalist terrorist. I was then horrified at the result, as so many did. So many did vote. This shocked me far more than the Enniskillen bomb, as that was expected in terms of the evil the IRA was capable of. Sorry, a typo there. I did hear that there were hundreds who spoiled their ballots by writing SDLP on them, and many nationalists would have voted for the Unionist candidate to try to stop the terrorists winning. I tried to keep these people in mind. Events such as the Sands election and the incidences of violence and the growing sectarianisation led many Protestants in the border area to conclude that there was a concerted campaign of ethnic violence. And this is a report by David Gardner. Within this climate, Gardner points out it's easier, well, this was the lesson that was taken, it was easier to keep your head down than to draw attention to yourself and attract the wrong kind of interests. Now, Gardner points out, goes on to extrapolate on this and suggests, you know, this is a self-reproducing logic, because once you start to keep your head down, you mix with the people who are also on your side, you reinforce each other in your suspicions and your beliefs, and that creates its own kind of inwardness and its own polarization. It creates its own kind of almost vicious cycle of suspicion, fear, self-reliance on your own community. And it can also have this kind of very negative kind of silo effect where you only kind of look to your own, to quote unquote, your own side. But this was the reality of living with these fears and suspicions. This kind of situation has been classically described in Albert Hirschman's book, which is on organisational studies, but it's been applied to many situations like East Germany and elsewhere, where he talks about whenever you are feeling disempowered, whenever you're feeling bullied, whenever you're feeling under stress, whenever you're feeling under threat, well, you've basically three options. You can leave. You can go get a job elsewhere, you can go to a different country, you can go to a different area. You can alternatively speak up, you can protest, you can exercise your democratic rights, you can put in complaints, you can go to a solicitor, whatever. Or you can remain loyal to the system and hope that the forces of law and order, of rectitude, of transparency and accountability that you're brought up to believe in, that these will come to prevail. The problem is that there's nowhere for people to exit to, but whenever people feel so attached to the land, to the community that they were born into. And this was a thing that came out. Where do you go? Yes, young people can move away, but if you've been farming the land, if you've been building up a business, if you've been working in a school, it's just not so easy to go. There's also a sense of shame that was coming out, because if you moved away, and people who did move away kind of articulated this, it was almost as if they, i.e. the Republican terrorists, had won. So there was this kind of reluctance in many ways not to move. There's a big tie to the land, especially those on the border, and I think because of, I don't know what you want to call it, ethnic cleansing that was going on at the time. Down there were a lot of people who were put out, and I would have a contact with the ones who came, who had to leave and come up into parts of Enniskillen and Omagh, and no alternative but to leave because they were being pushed out of their farms. A colleague of mine, Niall Gilmartin, published a book on displacement, I think just last year, the year before, 2022, and he put the figure of displacement at thousands, and he also looked at displacement in urban settings. Ken Funston, who wrote this book with, he has estimated there was at least 56 families in Fermanagh who had to leave their homes, and he suggests this is just the tip of the iceberg, because this is just drawn on lists, kind of triangulating from interviews. As I say, many people were reluctant to leave. They had nowhere else to go. They felt a pull of the land. They were also, as I say, had this misplaced sense of shame that they were succumbing to an enduring threat. As one of our interviewees put it, we never wanted to admit that they won, that they got their way, end quote. This is continuing to go on. 2013, the main quote-unquote Protestant secondary school, again to go back to that terminology, it's the maintained sector, the Catholic is in the controlled sector. I think I'm pretty right about that. But essentially the Protestant school was shut down. This obviously has ripple effects. Where do the feeder schools, they start to shut down, because where are you going to send your kids to? Families are moving away. Self-segregation is a major aspect of sectarian life in Northern Ireland still, where people live beside co-religionists in order to get their kids into the Catholic or Protestant school that they want their kids to go to. So this continues on. So moving to the conclusion, just about keeping to time, miraculously. I think a lot of people remember Enniskillen. 11 people killed on Remembrance Day, 1987. 10 died at the scene, 1 later in the hospital. And people remember the scenes of the aftermath of the horrific atrocity that it was. 63 people were injured. What's often forgotten about that day is that there was a bigger bomb planted in Tullyhoman at 20 miles away to explode at the same time. The bomb there was 4 times the size of the bomb that had been placed in Enniskillen. The Remembrance Parade in the village of Tullyhoman consisted of a pipe band, a few veterans, the Boys and Girls Brigades, and a police officer at the front and the rear. If that bomb had have gone off, it would have decimated the children from that area. And it was just pure luck that it didn't go off. It was assessed later on that either a tractor or an animal had caused a break in the command wire of the device. The bomb consisted of beer kegs and plastic containers filled with explosives. It was secreted in a hedge near to where the children of the youth organisations had formed up to start their parade. Both that bomb and the bomb in Enniskillen were judged by the journalist Peter Taylor, who had spoken to senior intelligence officers and had informants within the Republican community. He suggested that there was at least 3 IRA brigades coordinating on those 2 bombs, and given the nature of the high profile and mass mayhem, mass bloodshed that was to ensue and that was planned, it would have had to have been green lighted by the Army Council. The leading figure in the Northern Command at the time, according to Peter Taylor, was Martin McGuinness. Now, as I say, this brings us into this area of, and I've talked a lot about, there was injuries, there's people killed, there's people had to move away because of threats and because of attempted assassinations. The Tullyhoman bomb is one of these areas where it's rarely mentioned. The French historian Pierre Nora talks of the lieux de mémoire, the places of memory. What happens whenever it's a non-place of memory? And I want to suggest that this frequently is becoming more and more apparent in Northern Ireland. Part of my own research a few years ago, I've been reading a short book put together by Wave Trauma Centre. It's a kind of cross-community trauma centre. It was initially set up by nurses working with victims during the Troubles and become one of the major kind of cross-community organisations. And they do a lot of different work, and they do various publications from time to time. And they published it, actually, I think this is the 2nd volume, where they've done a project on people who were injured. So I'd picked this up somewhere, I don't know, but I was kind of reading through it, and I came across this story within it. And it was about a woman who had been working in a fish and chip shop in Castlewellan. It's a Friday evening, and there's a young kid had come in to get, a tin of Coke and a chip, and she just turned away. She turned back to him, and she just saw a bin explode coming up through the air. She survived the attack. But she says in her testimony in the book, before the bomb, I was bubbly, outgoing, and confident. I've become withdrawn, with no confidence. I'm shy, depressed, and suffer from insomnia. Deafness is lonely and isolating. She survived the bomb, but her injuries eventually caused her to go deaf. My husband and children are victims too because of my deafness. I've missed out on a lot with my children. The two older girls were in drama groups, putting on musicals, and my son was the lead vocalist in the school choir. I went to see them, but I couldn't hear them singing. I couldn't find any documentary evidence for this. I didn't know what year it was because it wasn't mentioned in the book. I thought, bomb had gone off. Quite a big town, big village, and the bomb had gone off. There must be something, somewhere recorded, but I couldn't. It wasn't in any of the main newspapers, and I didn't know. I could have went to the Morn Observer, which would have been the local paper. Where would you start to find this out? So I knew the director of Wave, Sandra Peake, and eventually I emailed her, and she hadn't got it, so she went and emailed the guy who had done the interview, who didn't have a clue about this, who then had to go back to this person who had been injured to find out that it was on such and such a date in 1985. A lot of this stuff, my point here is, a lot of this stuff isn't recorded anywhere. A lot of this stuff is to do with people's personal memories. Events like this, I'm sure, it was probably in some police log or some army log, but how do you get access to that kind of stuff? It was just so mundane, so banal that it wasn't picked up on any of the main, the BBC or the Irish News or the Irish Times. It wasn't reported in any of the major newspapers. Nobody had died, but this woman had lost her hearing, and it had this massive impact on her life and her family life. And so events like this, and some of the events that I've tried to talk about and pinpoint today, have these ripples and these manifestations way beyond the events at the time. How we find out about them, most of them are private, and people want to keep them private, and that's fair enough. But the politics of them continues to persist. The politics of them continues to shape contemporary society in Northern Ireland. The politics of them aren't going away. I don't think there's any easy answers to any of that, but that kind of brings me to the end of the talk, and it's been a downbeat talk with a downbeat ending, so apologies again for that, but thanks for hearing me out. So, thank you.